FromSoftware games can be pretty tough. I usually make guides about how to level up your character, but as Nightreign approaches, I wanted to instead make a guide about leveling yourself up as a player. So in this video, I'll take you through all the stuff I wish I knew when I started playing these games. From how to approach the very basics to some more advanced stuff you might not have thought about yet. So in the eternal struggle to get good, here's what I'd start with. The dodge roll is the core of Souls gameplay, by far the most effective and efficient way of negating damage in any of the games. One of the most important things to know about rolling in Souls games is that in all of the FromSoftware titles and many Souls-likes, the roll happens on button release and not on button press. This makes perfect sense when you think about it. If it happened on button press, running would be impossible. But I know from mentioning this in previous guides, not everyone realises this consciously. What this means in practice is that to time your roll accurately, you want to hit and release the dodge button as quickly as possible. My method is to think of the action as a whack of the button rather than a press, to give me the fastest possible release. Unlike some other games, the dodge roll isn't intended to be utilised as a way of getting out of range of enemy attacks, but rather to completely nullify the incoming damage by being invincible for the duration of the roll. This is called iframes, or invincibility frames. As soon as the roll is activated, you become invincible for a certain number of frames. The amount of frames differs slightly between games, but more importantly, between different levels of equip load. The penalty to your iframes from having heavy equip load is rarely much to worry about, but it's the length of the animation, where you're vulnerable and not in control of your character, that will catch you out in fights. The distance of the roll is also affected by equip load, with the light load character travelling the furthest, followed by the mid load, with heavy load trailing far behind. So that's the anatomy of the roll. After the release of the dodge button, your character becomes invincible for a certain number of frames, and that number is dictated by your character's current equip load. No, you're not in this video, fuck off. I love you and we'll talk later, but fuck off. Many attacks in the Souls series, Bloodborne and Elden Ring, have hitboxes that will punish you for rolling too early. Gale swipes are the perfect visual example of this. If you roll too early, the iframes will keep you safe from the sword. However, they won't last long enough to save you from the cape. If you leave the roll to the last minute, however, the iframes will last just long enough to dodge both the sword and the cape. So leaving the roll as late as possible is the best habit to get into. So with this basic understanding of the roll, you should be able to fight an enemy like Shade Godfrey relatively easily. Watch the flow of the attack and time your dodge for when it's just about to hit. Easy. But some attacks are slightly more complex. A roll catch is an attack that's deliberately designed to trick you into rolling too early, letting the actual attack hit you as you exit your roll. There are many examples of the roll catch going all the way back to Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1, but probably the first time you really noticed it was fighting Nameless King in Dark Souls 3. Nameless King really sticks out in DS3 as a boss that feels completely different to the rest of the game because of the amount of roll catch attacks he has. Compared to many other FromSoft bosses, Nameless really felt like the roll catch king. Until that is, we ended up in the lands between. Elden Ring takes the idea of roll catching and turns it up to 11, with the vast majority of bosses both in the main game and in Shadow of the Erdtree, with so many attacks having almost dummy animations to trick you into rolling too early and catching you on the way out. The way to deal with a roll catch is to be braver than you want to be, to wait longer to roll, to wait until you see the attack actually coming towards you before hitting that dodge button. But there can be problems with that as well. Snap attacks, as I call them, are moves where the swing happens too fast for you to be able to react to. In Elden Ring, again, these are far more common. From Margit's hilariously long wind-up into instant swing, to Noble's slow wind-up into instant stab, even the Shadow Tree avatar's explosion. For these attacks, if you can consciously see them happening, you've probably already been hit by them. When you're up against a boss with loads of snap attacks, it's experience in the fight rather than reaction-based skill that will get you through them. The more you see the attack, the more you'll be able to internalise the timing of it and gain better intuition on when to dodge. Some of these attacks do have little visual cues too. Margit does a very slight tense up right before the attack. Noble moves his hand right before the stab, although this doesn't work for parrying as it can be off screen. And the Erdtree avatar, his chest reaches a certain level of shininess that's hard to describe, and that's where I roll. That's a fucking shit example now I think of it. Now I have to talk about blocking without sounding like the worst kind of Bloodborne elitist that I secretly am. As a general rule, blocking is a worse alternative to dodging in FromSoftware games. Using it will almost always put you in a worse position to retaliate against enemies than just rolling their attacks would. I'm certainly not saying blocking isn't useful. In fact, there's many examples of it being very powerful. In Dark Souls 1, for example, you can absolutely breeze through a lot of the game just by waiting for a hollow to hit your block, then attacking. And in Elden Ring, with the addition of the guard counter mechanic, blocking can be exceptionally powerful. But if you're a new or relatively new player with the temptation to use blocking as an easier solution to rolling, I'd warn you that you're going to have a much harder time going through the games and making a variety of builds. So the best advice I have is, unless you are deliberately building a character around blocking, use it when it's useful, but try not to rely on it as a crutch. Attacking might seem self-explanatory, but it's where so many new and not so new players can go wrong. In fact, I'd bet the majority of deaths across all Souls history happen during the player attacking. Because of this, probably the most famous Souls adage was born: don't be greedy. It's the easiest trap to fall into. How many deaths have happened because you thought you could squeeze one extra attack into that gap? How many times have you died while the boss is one hit away from death because you were sure you could get that final attack in? The solution to greed, and possibly the best advice I have for anyone learning any FromSoftware boss, is only attack once. Dodge the boss's attack, do a single R1, wait for the next attack. By only doing this one attack, you immediately slow the pace of a fight, but in doing so you make it seem so much more manageable and give yourself so much more time to react. I promise you this will be transformational if you've never tried it before. Sometimes you'll do it and notice that you could have easily got another 2 attacks in, depending on your weapon. In this case, try and make a mental note of that opportunity being a good one. Sometimes you'll just get your attack off in time for the next dodge. And sometimes you'll get hit halfway through your attack, and you can mentally write that off as an opportunity at all. By doing this just a few times on any specific boss, you'll start to gain a picture of where all of the attack opportunities are and are not. Over time, put an extra attack in the bigger gaps, and eventually you'll have a complete picture of every attack opportunity in the fight. And if the number 1 killer in Souls fights is attacking, then number 2 is almost certainly healing. In probably the majority of games, healing is something that can be done at any time, at no cost to the player. If you're used to instantaneous healing in other games, then the slow drinking animation present in Souls games might come as a bit of a shock. Just like attacking, healing is an animation where you are locked in and open for damage during it. The surprising thing about this is almost everyone knows this, but not everyone treats healing like a separate animation. With so many players taking damage, then immediately going for the heal out of reflex, only to die while chugging their flask. The solution is my next massive tip for FromSoftware bosses. Treat healing like a big attack. If you haven't got enough time for a charged R2, you don't have enough time to heal. Positioning can be important too. One of the biggest breakthroughs I ever made in my playing was the conscious decision to start healing right next to bosses rather than running away. Doing this forces you to actually wait for an opportunity to heal, rather than spamming heal and hoping. It will also keep you safe from the wide variety of distance closing heal punishes that so many modern FromSoft bosses have. Now this section on leveling is not going to be me breaking down the soft caps and hard caps for each stat in each of the games, because let's be honest, I'm probably not the person to lecture anyone on that, as my approach to leveling is not what you'd call refined. Instead, I wanted to focus on the general philosophy you should have towards your levels. And to do this, here's a theoretical scenario. Let's say you're heading into Morgott in Lane Dell on your first casual playthrough. You have enough runes from Godfrey for 5 additional levels. Do you put them towards a damage stat? Or your stamina and health? Well, let's do some testing. Say you were using the Godskin Peeler, a weapon with B scaling in Dex with a Keen infusion. If your Dex is at 25 and you level your health, it takes 34 light attacks to kill Morgott. If, however, you went for big damage and leveled up your Dex beforehand, it would take 31 hits to kill Morgott. So in practical terms, those 5 new levels in Dex will mean you have to maybe dodge 1 or 2 less attacks in the fight. If you're consistently getting Morgott down to 5% health, those levels will make a difference. If you're dying in the middle of the fight though, this will not solve your problems. With the Serpent Hunter, a weapon with S scaling in strength, meaning that levels will have the most effect, the difference between 25 strength and 30 strength is 13 charged attacks to kill him, and 12. With a Keen Uchigatana, which has bleed, 25 Dex will kill Morgott in 25 R1s. 30 Dex will result in the same number, and even going 10 levels higher in Dex won't take a hit off the fight. Now these are far from perfect examples. These results will vary with every game, build, weapon, character level, and boss. My aim here is to hopefully show you that the mental relationship you have to investing in damage stats doesn't always manifest itself as actually being useful against the boss that you're stuck on. In all of these examples, however, leveling your HP or stamina would be noticeable. 5 levels in Vigor here will prevent you from being one-shot by the blood attacks in Phase 2, as might the armour you could wear by investing in stamina. And yeah, the guy who consistently makes guides about being naked with a fuck-off great hammer is telling you to level Vigor and wear armour, I know. But for games that you're learning, it's very wise to prioritise survivability over damage stats. In fact, what you're currently watching is effectively a level 1 character, but with giant health and stamina bars, absolutely bully the late game, using damage from talismans and buffs alone. For the next tip, I want to move away from boss fights and talk about navigating areas. And for that, we're going to need a really good one. Central Yharnam was the very first chapter of my Souls journey, and might still be my favourite area of any FromSoftware title. Mainly because of this door, halfway up the street. After getting my arse handed to me many times by these 4 patrolling enemies in the alley, I finally made it to the corner and saw for the first time the bonfire. Everything I had ever learned about playing video games told me that this door had to open somehow. This had to be the way forward. Because after experiencing how tough it was to fight these 3 enemies, there's no way I was expected to deal with this. I can still remember the feeling of absolute hopelessness I felt when I realised that I was. The thing about this area though, is it's so well designed. Yes, from the very start of the game you've been picking up pebbles, which can be thrown to pull or distract enemies. But even if you hadn't figured that out, there's still so many safety mechanisms in place. Moving nearer to the bonfire will pull only a couple of enemies at a time, allowing you to back off and deal with them separately in relative safety. The aggro range of the gunman facing you prevents him from spotting you if you keep to the right. Dropping down to this area will enable you to bait out and kill the dog without aggroing the gunman. This area here is a little safe zone, where gradually the enemies patrolling the bonfire will spot you and come over in pairs. Once you've cleaned up all the patrols, you can sneak up on this gunman and kill him without alerting the other. Run to the central gunman, clean up the 3 around the bonfire, then finally take care of the trio patrolling the alley. By the time you've taken out every enemy around the bonfire and take a minute to reflect on what just happened, you'll often realise that the most dangerous part of everything you just did was fighting those first 4 guys in the alley. That's the only time you had to fight more than 3 enemies at once. Before this turns into 4 hours of me gushing about Central Yharnam, I do have a point here. FromSoftware are the absolute masters of showing you an area, path, or boss that looks both terrifying and impossible, whilst taking great care in making sure that it is fair and manageable. For a studio so well known for their game's difficulty, it's surprisingly rare for them to just be outright spiteful with areas and enemy placements. Seriously, fuck off. Quite often, when you come across something terrifying in a FromSoft title, it's actually just Miyazaki telling you to think. Sometimes it's stealth and aggro mechanics like you see in Yharnam. Sometimes there's a different path that's way less dangerous. Sometimes that boss's massive health bar is a sign that there's more to the fight than you think. Sometimes that strange item that you picked up hours ago suddenly seems really useful. And sometimes it's because you've strayed down the wrong path and you're just not equipped for the area that you're in just yet. It won't always be the case. Sometimes it really is just that difficult. But if you always assume that there's something you're missing, I promise you that in the search for whatever that could be, you'll learn more about the game than if you just brute force it with skill. Parrying has been around since the very start of Souls, and it's undergone a bit of a journey in its effectiveness and rewards versus risk over the years. What used to be a very risky way of fighting hollows in Dark Souls is now by far the easiest way of beating Elden Ring's final challenge. I suppose the first question you need to ask when considering parrying is whether it's worth it at all. There are some enemies that feel completely defanged, as soon as you realise you can parry them. From Gwyn in Dark Souls 1 to Crucible Knights in Elden Ring. Other enemies like Elden Ring's Godskin Apostle and in the extreme Mesmer are so hard to parry that the only reason to ever do it is to challenge yourself by deliberately making life harder than it should be. Elden Ring's 2 peaks of difficulty are great examples of this. Getting Malenia parries to about 80% consistency took me over a dozen hours when I made my guide for her back in 2022. And the journey from 80 to 99% continues, I think, to this day. In stark contrast, parrying Consort Radahn is so much more forgiving that I reckon I had Malenia levels of parry consistency by the end of my first playthrough of the DLC, and Consort stands as the biggest advertisement for parrying, as a boss I'd recommend the approach to, even for people who have no interest in doing it for any other boss. This is because parrying is an excellent way of controlling the fight, and controlling an enemy's moveset. For a boss like Consort, with long, hard-to-dodge combos that can be completely avoided by a single parry at the start, it's so powerful. So how do you do it? The ancient parry wisdom is to focus on the enemy's arm and not the weapon. Parry when the hand approaches your body, and you'll get it regardless of whether you're parrying a dagger or a greatsword. To this day, it's probably still the best advice I have for anyone trying to learn the mechanic. It works perfectly for almost every enemy in the DS trilogy, and a whole bunch of Elden Ring foes like Radagon, Tree Sentinels, Midra, and Consort Radahn. With the frequency of snap attacks in Elden Ring though, that does become more difficult. For these faster attacks where it's not possible, the only solution is like rolling these attacks, either to internalise the timing of the attack as a whole, or find a visual or audio cue for your input. If you're new to the channel, I'm somewhat of a parry nerd, and there's a whole bunch of in-depth parrying tutorials for Elden Ring enemies and bosses you can search for here if you're interested. Bloodborne has a very different feeling parry mechanic generally. While the traditional logic still works for certain attacks, you'll find that using Dark Souls or Elden Ring parry timings in Bloodborne often leads to you getting the parry, but also being hit for inputting too late. I like to think of gun parries as an interrupt rather than a deflection, interrupting the swing itself rather than deflecting the strike. So if it's a gun in your hand rather than a buckler, go a little earlier than you think. With the recent introduction of the deflect mechanic in Elden Ring, and I suspect the return of Sekiro deflections in Nightreign, all of this advice is the same for deflecting as well. The satisfaction of a good parry fight for me is unparalleled. However, no matter how proficient you are at it, it's always going to be a massive risk, and learning it will get you killed a lot more than simply ignoring it. Something to bear in mind for that final boss of a rough Nightreign run. Have you ever watched a really experienced player fight the same boss that you're having a nightmare with, and it just looks like they're fighting a different boss? For you, the boss speeds around the arena doing all the worst attacks and giving you absolutely no room to punish anything. But for your favourite challenge runner, they just seem to stand there waiting to be smacked in the face with a charged R2. If yes, then what you're probably seeing is some form of AI manipulation. Every boss operates under a certain set of rules. If the player does X, the boss will do or is much more likely to do Y. These calculations can be based on distance, position, or actions, and if you have a good knowledge of a boss and its parameters, you can use this information against it. Here's a position-based one. When Radahn does this big pull attack, if you roll it to the side and end up behind or next to him, he'll breeze right into his next attack, which you'll have to dodge. However, If you're in front of him after it, he'll do the follow-up and give you a massive attack opportunity. For a distance example, take Commander Nile. When you're at a distance, he'll either jump at you with the electric foot or do the small tornado attack, both of which you can punish and simply run away from. These moves are so likely that for a low level or challenge run, you can just get him stuck in a loop of doing either of these attacks for a free fight. And we've already spoke about how common action-based ones are, with the aforementioned heal punishes. I could go on for ages with more examples, and if that sounds good, I've started a series of shorts demonstrating examples of these, as I find them interesting, so check those out if you do too. Now of course you can pick this stuff up from watching better players, but if you want to figure it out yourself, it's all about experimentation and testing. It's really easy to fall into a trap of dodging a particular attack one way and sticking to it because it works. If you want to figure out strats like this though, you have to try 10 different ways of avoiding an attack and seeing which one puts you in the best position to punish the boss. It's almost never the first one that you tried. Now I want to talk about strafing, and yeah, alright, okay, fine. If there's one thing that's better than dodging every attack perfectly, it's not needing to dodge them at all. Strafing might sound like something that should have been at the start of this video, but typically it's something you see more experienced players doing, while the less experienced ones are panic rolling around the arena. Dark Souls 2 has a stat called adaptability, which functions in the game as almost a new mechanic. A stat that you have to put levels into to achieve the same iframes you have by default in Dark Souls 1. But in reality, it's not as important as you think, as a ton of DS2 bosses can be beaten by simply walking around their attacks rather than actually rolling them. Strafing goes hand in hand with unlocking your camera. When you're locked on to an enemy or boss, your movement becomes relative to their position and their movement. The majority of the time, to be clear, this is a good thing. Trying to fight a boss that moves around as much as Malenia is incredibly tough when not locked on. However, by locking off, you gain complete control of your movement, and are able to get into positions that are far more difficult or even impossible when locked on. Using strafing and unlocking together almost feels like a cheat code in the earlier games. But even in Elden Ring, where boss tracking has improved dramatically, you can still use this method to create opportunities that you don't think are there at first glance. I really recommend checking out some no-roll runs for some insane examples of how effective this can be. If you're ever trying to figure out how to dodge a particularly tricky attack and nothing else seems to be working, try unlocking your camera before or during the attack and see if you can find positioning that makes it easier. And that's it. The most important things that I've picked up over the years that will hopefully give you something else to think about whilst exploring these incredible games. I've deliberately kept these ones general enough to be useful in all of the games, but if you'd like to see some more specific tips in the future, let me know in the comments. As always, thanks for watching.